Time seems to stand still in the dusty community center of Cedar Grove, where an old Steinway piano sits forgotten in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. For Harold Mitchell, 72, and wrestling with the silence of his empty days, it beckons like a lighthouse in the dark. His arthritic fingers hover over the keys, trembling with memory. The melody that flows forth isn't just music. It's 30 years of love, loss, and longing, distilled into notes that float through the building's hollow halls. He doesn't notice Margaret Anderson frozen in the doorway, her hand pressed to her, hot, tears streaming down her face as the familiar tune carries her back to her wedding day, 40 years ago. In this moment, neither realizes that destiny has orchestrated their paths to cross, using an old piano as its instrument of fate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold's morning routine hadn't changed in the 3 years since Claire's passing. He would wake at precisely 6:15 a.m., make coffee for 2, and catch himself just before pouring the second cup. The kitchen walls, once warm with Claire's favorite yellow paint, now seemed to mock him with their cheerfulness. Photos of their life together lined the hallway, their wedding day, Sarah's graduation, family vacations that felt like yesterday, and a lifetime ago all at once. The move to Cedar Grove hadn't been his choice. Sarah, their only daughter, had insisted after finding him talking to Claire's empty chair one too many times. "Dad, you need to be closer to us," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "Mom would want you to live, not just exist." He'd wanted to tell her that existing was all he knew how to do now, that living felt like a betrayal to 30 years of marriage. But he'd packed up their memories instead. His new house was practical, a single story with no stairs to challenge his arthritic knees, close to the medical center, and just 10 minutes from Sarah's family. But it wasn't home. Home was Claire's garden, with its riot of spring colors, the creaky step on the porch that they'd never fixed, and the kitchen where they'd danced to old records on Sunday mornings. Sarah called every day at 7 p.m., regular as clockwork. She'd talk about her kids, Tommy's soccer games, Emma's dance recitals, and gently probe about his social life. "Have you tried the community center, Dad? They have programs for seniors." The word made him wince. Seniors. When had he become that? In his mind, he was still the young professor of literature who'd fallen in love with the art student painting. In the university courtyard, his fingers, twisted now with arthritis, traced the spine of Claire's favorite book on his bedside table. Pride and Prejudice. She'd read it at least once a year, and he'd teased her about being a hopeless romantic. Now he understood. Romance wasn't just about the fire of first love. It was about the quiet moments, the comfortable silences, the way she'd known to bring him tea during late-night grading sessions without him asking. The community center had been Sarah's idea too. "Volunteer, Dad. You need purpose." He'd gone reluctantly, expecting a room full of decrepit old folks playing bingo. Instead, he found himself organizing books in their small library, his professor's heart warming at introducing children to literature during story time. But it was the piano that caught his eye on that first day, a grand old Steinway, neglected but dignified, like a dowager duchess fallen on hard times. He hadn't touched a piano since the funeral, where he'd played Claire's favorite Chopin nocturne. Music had been their shared language. He'd play while she painted, each feeding off the other's creativity. After she died, the silence felt right, felt like respect for what they'd lost. But seeing that piano, its rich mahogany dulled by dust, stirred something in him he thought had died with Claire. His hands shook as he brought them to rest on the keys that first day. The middle C was slightly out of tune, but the note rang true enough to bring tears to his eyes. Behind him, the activity room bustled with afternoon programs, but in his mind, he was back in their living room, Claire at her easel. The autumn, light making her silver hair glow like a halo. Sarah noticed the change in him during their calls. "You sound different, Dad," she said one evening, more present. He couldn't explain that the piano had become a bridge between then and now, between memory and possibility. How could he tell his daughter that when he played, he felt Claire's approval, her gentle nudge to step back into the world? The arthritis made practice painful, but he persevered. Each morning, he arrived earlier to the center, working through scales and simple pieces before the daily activities began. The piano's voice grew stronger as he cleaned it, loved it, brought it back to life. Like him, it just needed someone to remember its worth. He didn't know then that the music would drift through the center's halls, that it would reach ears he hadn't meant it for, that it would become the overture to a story he never expected to live. He was just a man trying to find his way through grief, one note at a time, unaware that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest of choices, like sitting down at an old piano on a quiet morning in Cedar Grove. The Cedar Grove Community Center had been a high school in the 1950s, and it wore its history in every creaking floorboard and worn banister. For Harold, the smell of old wood and floor wax brought back memories of his teaching days. The front desk was staffed by Betty Thompson, a retired nurse with bottle-red hair and an endless supply of hard candies that she pressed into everyone's hands, whether they wanted them or not. "You're early again, Harold," she'd say each morning, her knowing smile suggesting she'd heard his playing. He'd grunt non-committally and shuffle past, pretending not to notice how she'd started unlocking the doors 15 minutes earlier just for him. The staff had begun referring to the activity room as Harold's studio during his morning practice sessions, though he insisted it wasn't practice, just an old man fooling around on an older piano. The Steinway, he discovered, had its own story. Miss June, who taught art classes on Wednesdays, told him it had been donated by a wealthy family in the 1970s. "Used to be the pride of the center," she said, adjusting her paint-splattered smock. "We had proper recitals here and everything. Shame about the budget cuts. No money for maintenance anymore." Harold found himself studying the piano with new eyes, noting the scarred finish, the sticky keys, the pedals that needed oiling. His arthritis made every morning a negotiation. Some days his fingers moved like rusty hinges, each note a small victory over pain. Other mornings they remembered their old flexibility, and he could lose himself in the music until Betty's gentle tap on the door reminded him that the morning programs were about to begin. The center's regulars became accustomed to the sound of classical music drifting through the halls. Mrs. Chen, who led the Tai Chi group, said his playing helped her students find their balance. The young mothers from the toddler reading group would pause outside the door, swaying with their children to the rhythm of a Beethoven sonata. Even Mr. Peterson, the cantankerous old veteran who complained about everything, would sit in the hallway during Harold's sessions, his cane tapping in time to the music. Harold began bringing sheet music from home, pieces he and Claire had loved. He found himself talking to her as he played, sharing gossip about the center's inhabitants. "You'd like Betty, dear," he'd murmur. "She's got your way of caring for people, whether they want it or not." Sometimes he imagined Claire's answers, her gentle teasing about him becoming the center's unofficial musician. The piano itself seemed to respond to the regular attention. Harold spent time each week cleaning it, learning its quirks. The B-flat key stuck slightly unless you approached it from an angle. The upper register had a brightness that belied the piano's age, while the bass notes resonated with a richness that made his chest vibrate. He found himself researching piano restoration, watching YouTube videos about tuning and maintenance. Sarah noticed the change in his voice when he talked about his mornings at the center. "You sound like your old self, Dad," she said during one of their evening calls. "Remember when you used to get this excited about your literature lectures?" He did remember. The passion for sharing something meaningful, the joy of watching, understanding dawn in someone's eyes. He hadn't expected to find that feeling again, certainly not in a dusty activity room with an aging piano. His fingers grew stronger as autumn deepened into winter. The arthritis still troubled him, but he learned to work around it, to choose pieces that wouldn't strain his hands too much. He developed a routine, arrives at 7:30, when Betty opened the doors early for him, gentle exercises to warm up his hands, scales to remind his fingers of their purpose, then an hour of real playing before the center's daily activities began. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that his private concerts had begun drawing an audience. People would find excuses to arrive early, sitting quietly in the hallway or peeking through the activity room's windows. The music filled an emptiness in the old building, transformed it from a place where people passed time into somewhere magic happened, and he remained unaware that among these silent listeners was a woman who stood in the shadows of the doorway, her heart remembering what it meant to feel something other than loss. As Harold lost himself in Chopin's nocturne in E-flat major, his eyes closed in concentration, he didn't see Margaret Anderson brush away tears, didn't notice how she pressed her hand to her heart as if to keep it from escaping her chest. The shared music spoke of shared understanding, of grief and hope intertwined, though its player and his unseen audience had yet to exchange a single word. Margaret Anderson's life was measured in the spaces between sounds, the silence at breakfast where Robert's morning crossword rustling should be, the absence of his off-key humming as he puttered in the garden, the missing sound of his gentle snoring that had lulled her to sleep for 42 years. 5 years after his heart attack, she still reached for him in the night, still made coffee strong the way he liked it, still caught herself saving articles about jazz concerts he would have enjoyed, her son Michael worried. He'd call 3 times a week from Seattle, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that children use with aging parents. "Mom, why don't you join that book club Linda mentioned? Or try the community center? You can't spend all your time talking to Dad's photographs." She didn't tell him that the photographs talked back, that sometimes she could hear Robert's laugh so clearly it made her heart stop. The first time she heard the piano, she thought she was dreaming. She'd gone to the community center to donate some of Robert's old books, letting go in small pieces, her therapist called it. The melody caught her halfway down the hall, a familiar Chopin nocturne that Robert had played at their wedding. Her feet moved of their own accord, following the music like a sailor drawn to a siren's call. Through the activity room's doorway, she saw him, elderly like her, with silver hair and shoulders slightly stooped, but his hands moved across the keys with a grace that belied his age. The morning light through the high windows caught the dust motes dancing around him, creating a halo effect that made her breath catch. She pressed herself against the doorframe, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. The music transported her. Suddenly she was 22 again, standing in her wedding dress as Robert played this very piece, his gift to her before they exchanged vows. She remembered the way he looked up at her then, his eyes full of promises they would spend a lifetime. Gaping, the tears came without warning, rolling down her cheeks as she watched this stranger's fingers craft the same magic. Every morning after that became a ritual. She'd arrive at the center just as Betty was opening up, exchanging knowing looks with the other early birds who gathered to listen. They were a secret audience, united in their understanding that acknowledging the concerts might somehow break their spell. Margaret learned the pianist's name from Betty, Harold Mitchell, a retired professor, widower like her. She watched him struggle some mornings, saw how he would flex his fingers and massage his knuckles between pieces. She recognized the arthritis dance. Robert had done the same in his later years, when his beloved jazz piano became too painful to play. On those mornings, she wanted to go to him, to share her knowledge of heat packs and paraffin treatments. But something held her back. The music he chose spoke of a love story as deep as her own. When he played Debussy, she could feel the tenderness in every note. His Beethoven carried the weight of loss, while his Mozart sparkled with memories of joy. Without knowing anything about him, she felt she knew everything that mattered. His wife's name was Claire. She overheard that from the staff, and Margaret found herself wondering about this woman who had shaped his musician's heart. One morning, he played a piece she didn't recognize. It wasn't classical, something more contemporary, but played with such emotion that Margaret had to lean against the wall for support. Later, she heard Betty telling another staff member it was from Up, some movie about love and loss and aging. Margaret went home and watched it alone, crying through the whole thing, understanding why he'd chosen it. Her son noticed the change in her during their calls. "You sound different, Mom. More alive." She couldn't explain that she'd found a connection to something larger than her grief, that this unseen bond with a stranger's music had awakened parts of her she thought had died with Robert. How could she tell her practical, worried son that she'd started wearing her good dresses to the center, that she'd begun paying attention to her appearance again, all for concerts where the musician didn't even know she existed? The other regular listeners became her friends. There was Anna, who brought coffee for everyone in paper cups from the diner across the street. John, a retired music teacher who would silently conduct along with the more dramatic pieces. Maria, who knitted endless scarves while she listened, her needles moving in time with the music. They were a family of sorts, bound together by this sacred morning ritual. But it was more than just the music. Margaret found herself studying Harold's face when he played, noting how his expression would soften during certain pieces, how his eyes would close during particularly emotional passages. She recognized the look of someone playing for a loved one no longer there. She'd seen it often enough in her mirror when she caught herself dancing alone in the kitchen to Robert's favorite songs. The morning he played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, something shifted. Margaret watched his hands move across the keys, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt the wall around her heart crack. The music wasn't just about remembering anymore. It was about the possibility of something new. The thought terrified her, sent her hurrying from the center before the piece was finished, her heart pounding with emotions she wasn't ready to name. It was Betty who finally broke the spell, in her well-meaning but forceful way. On a crisp October morning, just as Harold was finishing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, she marched into the activity room with Margaret in tow. "Harold Mitchell, it's high time you met your biggest fan." Harold's fingers stumbled on the keys, the final notes of the sonata scattering like startled birds. He turned to find himself face to face with a woman he'd never seen before, yet something about her seemed familiar. She wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, her silver hair swept back in an elegant twist, and her cheeks were flushed with what might have been embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," Margaret stammered, shooting Betty a look that could have frozen water. "I didn't mean to intrude. Your playing is just... It reminds me of..." She stopped, unable to find the right words. Harold found himself standing, his joints protesting the sudden movement. "No intrusion," he managed, though his heart was racing at this unexpected confrontation. "I'm just an old man keeping the dust off the keys." "You're being modest," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "That was Beethoven's Opus 27, number 2. My husband used to play it, though never quite so." She paused, searching for the word. Tenderly, the word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Harold's hands, still trembling slightly, found the piano bench again. "Your husband was a musician." "Was," Margaret confirmed, and Harold recognized the weight of that past tense. He'd used it enough himself. Robert played jazz primarily, but he loved classical pieces too. He'd be horrified to know how out of tune this poor piano is. Harold found himself chuckling. "The A-flat in the middle register is particularly offensive. I've been thinking of looking into having it tuned, but it feels like crossing a line," Margaret finished for him, "like you're taking ownership of something that isn't yours." Their eyes met in shared understanding. Betty, watching from the doorway, smiled smugly and slipped away, her matchmaking mission accomplished. "I'm Harold," he said, realizing he hadn't properly introduced himself, "though I suppose you knew that." "Margaret Anderson," she replied, taking a tentative step closer to the piano. "I've been listening to you play for weeks now. We all have. She gestured toward the hallway, where the usual crowd of morning listeners quickly pretended to be deeply engaged in other activities. Harold felt his face grow warm. I had no idea. I thought I was just, well, I don't know what I thought. You were healing, Margaret said simply. We all recognized it because we're all doing the same thing, in our own ways. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the same quiet grief in her eyes that he saw in his mirror every morning. But there was something else too. Spark of life, of possibility. Would you like to sit? He found himself asking, sliding over on the piano bench. I was about to attempt some Chopin, though I warn you, my fingers aren't what they used to be. Margaret hesitated for just a moment, before settling beside him on the bench, careful to leave a proper distance between them. Neither are any of our parts, she said with a small smile, but we make do. The morning light streamed through the high windows, catching the dust motes in its beams as Harold began the opening notes of Chopin's waltz in a minor. He was acutely aware of Margaret beside him, of the subtle lavender scent of her perfume, of the way she swayed almost imperceptibly to the music. As he played, he found himself talking, something he never did during his morning sessions. He told her about Claire's love for Chopin, about their Sunday morning concerts in their living room, about the way arthritis had slowly stolen the music from his fingers until this piano had given it back. Margaret listened, offering her own stories in return. She spoke of Robert's jazz club days, of dancing in their kitchen to Duke Ellington records, of the silence that had followed his passing. Their words flowed between the notes, creating a new kind of music. When the waltz ended, neither moved to leave the bench. The usual morning crowd had dispersed, leaving them alone in the sunlit room. "Same time tomorrow?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying a hint of hope that made Harold's heart skip. "I'll be here," he replied, surprised to find himself smiling, "though I can't promise the A-flat will behave any better. Some things are perfect in their imperfection," Margaret said, standing slowly. She smoothed her dress and gave him a small nod. "Thank you for the concert, Harold." He watched her leave, her blue dress bright against the worn wooden floors. The activity room felt different somehow, as if the space itself had shifted to accommodate this new reality. When he turned back to the piano, his fingers found the keys with renewed purpose, and for the first time in years, he played not for the memory of what was lost, but for the promise of what might be. The next few weeks brought subtle changes to the community center's morning routine. Margaret started bringing 2 cups of coffee from Joe's diner across the street, one black with a hint of sugar, just as Harold had mentioned he liked it. Harold found himself arriving even earlier, taking more care with his appearance, making sure his collar was straight and his sweater free of lint. Their morning conversations became a delicate dance of revelation and restraint. Between pieces, they shared fragments of their lives like carefully wrapped gifts. Harold learned that Margaret had been a high school art teacher, that she had a son in Seattle and a daughter in Boston, that she still painted watercolors in her sunroom every afternoon. Margaret discovered Harold's passion for Shakespeare, his collection of first editions, his secret love for detective novels that he considered his guilty pleasure. "Claire used to tease me about those," he said one morning, accepting the coffee Margaret offered. "She'd find me reading Raymond Chandler at 3 in the morning and just shake her head." Margaret smiled, settling into what had become her spot on the piano bench. "Robert had his crossword puzzles. He'd wake me up to ask for obscure words, claiming his best thinking happened at midnight." The center's regulars watched their blooming friendship with poorly concealed interest. Betty had taken to referring to them as her success story, though she was wise enough not to say it within their hearing. Miss June scheduled her art classes later to avoid interrupting their morning sessions. Even Mr. Peterson grumbled less about the classical music drifting through the halls. "You know they're all talking about us," Margaret mentioned one day, watching Harold work through his finger exercises. He paused, flexing his stiff joints. "Does it bother you?" "I'm more worried about what our children would say," she admitted. Michael's still convinced I need to move to Seattle to be properly looked after. Harold understood. Sarah had called. Just the other night, her voice tight with concern when he mentioned his morning piano sessions and his friend Margaret. Dad, are you sure this is appropriate? Appropriate. The word echoed in his mind as his fingers found their way into the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. What was appropriate for two people their age? Were they supposed to ignore the spark of connection, the comfort of shared understanding, just because they'd both lived full lives already? Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. We're not doing anything wrong, you know. We're just two people who enjoy music and conversation. And coffee, Harold added, making her laugh. The sound of her laughter mixed with the melody, creating something new and unexpected. Their friendship grew in small moments. Margaret brought him a tube of arthritis cream that Robert had sworn by. Harold shared a book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy. They discovered a shared love for old movies, particularly anything with Audrey Hepburn. When Harold mentioned he'd never seen Breakfast at Tiffany's, Margaret's eyes lit up. "We should watch it sometime," she said, then immediately looked down at her hands, as if surprised by her own boldness. Harold's fingers stumbled on the keys. The invitation hung in the air, full of possibility and terror. Watching a movie together would mean meeting outside the safe confines of the community center, would mean acknowledging that their relationship was becoming something more than just morning coffee and piano music. "I'd like that," he heard himself say, his heart racing like a teenager's. "Though I warn you, I tend to fall asleep during movies these days." "Then we'll make it a matinee," Margaret replied, her smile brightening the room more than the morning sun. The news of their planned movie afternoon spread through the center like wildfire. Betty practically beamed when she overheard them discussing potential dates. Miss June offered to loan them her DVD copy, though they politely declined, having already decided to watch it at the small theater downtown that showed classic films on Sundays. Their children's reactions were less enthusiastic. Sarah called that evening, her voice carefully neutral. "A movie date, Dad. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "It's not a date," Harold protested, though the words felt hollow. "We're friends, enjoying a classic film together. Mom would want you to be happy," Sarah said after a long pause. I worry." Margaret faced similar concerns from her son. "Mom, you barely know this man," Michael insisted during their weekly call. "What do you really know about him? What did they know about each other?" Harold pondered this as his fingers moved through Bach's prelude in C major. He knew the way Margaret's eyes crinkled when she smiled, how she hummed along unconsciously to certain pieces, how she always seemed to sense when his hands were hurting and would gently suggest a break. He knew she took her coffee with cream but no sugar, that she wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck, that she carried tissues in her sleeve like his grandmother used to do. Small details, perhaps, but weren't lives built on such things. The accumulation of shared moments, of understood preferences, of comfortable silences and gentle laughter. One morning, as November painted the windows with frost, Harold arrived to find Margaret already at the piano, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. She looked up as he entered, slightly embarrassed. "I was just remembering Robert. Tried to teach me years ago, but I never had the patience." Harold set down their coffees and sat beside her. "It's never too late to learn," he said softly. Without thinking, he reached out to adjust her hand position, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch sent a jolt through both of them, and, for a moment, neither moved. Then Margaret pressed down on the keys, producing a slightly discordant chord that made them both laugh, breaking the tension. But something had shifted, as subtle yet significant as the changing of seasons. They were no longer just two people sharing music and memories. They were stepping into something new, something that scared and thrilled them in equal measure, as Harold began to show her the basic finger positions for a simple melody. He realized that perhaps this was what healing truly meant, not the absence of grief, but the courage to let joy in again, one note at a time. The morning of their first real piano lesson dawned cold and bright. Margaret arrived early, wearing a cream-colored sweater and carrying a beginner's piano book she'd found in a local music store. Harold pretended not to notice how she'd styled her hair differently, just as she pretended not to notice his freshly pressed shirt. "I haven't been this nervous since my first day teaching art," Margaret admitted, settling onto the piano bench. Her shoulder brushed against Harold's, and neither moved to create more space between them. "Middle C," Harold said softly, guiding her hand to the correct key. "That's where everything begins." His fingers trembled slightly as they touched hers, and not from arthritis. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation both wonderful and terrifying. Margaret pressed the key, and the note rang clear through the morning quiet. "Middle C," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Because it's in the middle, because it's the heart of everything," Harold found himself saying. He could smell her lavender perfume, could feel the slight tremor in her hand beneath his. "From here, we can go anywhere." They started with scales, simple exercises that Harold had taught countless times during his years giving piano lessons to neighborhood children. But teaching Margaret was different. When she struggled with a fingering, her frustrated laugh sent shivers down his spine. When she successfully completed a simple melody, her triumphant smile made his heart race. "Robert tried to teach me once," she said, working through the notes of "Mary Had a Little Lamb" with careful concentration. "But he had no patience. He couldn't understand why I couldn't just feel the music like he did." Harold nodded, understanding perfectly. "Claire was the same with painting. She'd try to teach me, but I was hopeless. Just feel the colors," she'd say, as if that explained everything. Their laughter mingled with the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret's fingers found the wrong key, creating a discordant note that made them both wince and laugh harder. "Here," Harold said, moving closer to demonstrate the correct position. His hands covered hers, and suddenly the laughter faded. Margaret's breath caught audibly, and Harold found himself frozen, acutely aware of how close they were, how natural it felt to be sharing this space, this moment. Time seemed to stop. Harold could hear his heart pounding in his ears, could feel the warmth of Margaret's shoulder against his. Her hands were soft beneath his weathered ones, and he noticed a small scar on her right index finger. "Paper cut," she said, following his gaze, "from grading art papers 20 years ago." Her voice was hushed, intimate in the quiet room. Harold's thumb brushed over the scar without conscious thought. Claire had one just like it, from her painting papers. The mention of their late spouses didn't bring the usual sharp pain. Instead, it felt like sharing a precious secret, like adding another thread to the tapestry of understanding they were weaving between them. Margaret turned her hand slightly, her fingers intertwining with his. The piano key beneath there joined. Hands pressed down, creating a single, sustained note that hung in the air between them. Neither moved to break the contact. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Margaret whispered, her eyes fixed on their hands. "Nervous about playing piano?" Harold asked, offering her an escape from the weight of the moment. She smiled, understanding his gesture, but choosing not to take it. "Nervous about everything." Before Harold could respond, Betty's voice rang out from the hallway, announcing the arrival of the morning yoga class. They separated quickly, like teenagers caught by a parent, though their hands lingered together for a moment longer than necessary. "Same time tomorrow?" Margaret asked, gathering her music book with slightly shaking hands. Harold nodded, his fingers already missing the warmth of hers. "We'll work on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You'll be playing Chopin in no time." "I have a very patient teacher," she said, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made him forget about his arthritis, his age, his fears. As she left, Harold remained at the piano, his fingers resting on the keys they had shared. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in years, he felt truly, completely alive. He began to play Claire's favorite nocturne, but the music felt different now. It wasn't a memorial anymore, but a bridge between. past and present, between loss and hope, between two hearts learning to beat in time again. The phone calls came on the same evening, as if their children had somehow synchronized their concerns. Harold was just settling into his armchair with a cup of tea when Sarah's number flashed on his screen. At nearly the same moment, in her cozy living room across town, Margaret was answering a call from Michael in Seattle. "Betty called me," Sarah began without preamble. "She thinks I should know that you're giving piano lessons to a woman named Margaret Anderson." Harold's teacup clinked against its saucer. "Betty should mind her own business," he said more sharply than he intended. "Dad, we're worried about you." Sarah's voice softened. "Mom's only been gone 3 years, and what?" Harold interrupted. "I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life alone. Would your mother have wanted that?" Across town, Margaret was having a similar conversation. "Mom, Linda from your book club called me," Michael said. "She says you've been spending every morning with some man at the community center." Margaret sighed, touching the wedding ring that still hung around her neck. "His name is Harold, and he's teaching me piano. That's all." "That's all?" Michael's skepticism carried clearly across the miles. "Mom, you're not looking to replace Dad, are you?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. "No one could ever replace your father," she said quietly. "But does that mean I'm not allowed to have friends?" Back in Harold's living room, Sarah was pressing on. "Of course, Mom would want you to be happy, but this seems so sudden. What do you really know about this woman?" Harold closed his eyes, remembering the feel of Margaret's hands under his on the piano keys. "I know she brings me coffee every morning, black with 1 sugar. I know she has a scar on her right index finger from grading art papers. I know she hums along unconsciously when I play Chopin. I know she understands what it means to love someone for 40 years and then have to learn to live without them." There was a long silence on the line. "You really like her, don't you?" Sarah's voice was small, almost childlike. "Yes," Harold admitted both to his daughter and to himself. "I do." Meanwhile, Margaret was defending herself to her son. "Michael, I'm 70 years old. I'm not some teenager you need to protect. Harold is a kind, intelligent man who's been through the same loss I have." "That's what worries me," Michael said. "Are you both just, I don't know, trying to replace what you've lost?" Margaret thought about that morning's piano lesson, about the way Harold's eyes crinkled when he smiled, about how he seemed to understand her without words. "No," she said firmly. "We're two people who've found something unexpected, something new." The conversations continued late into the evening, both children eventually retreating from their initial positions but leaving their parents emotionally drained. After hanging up, Harold found himself at his own piano at home, playing softly, in the darkness, thinking about Margaret's smile. The next morning they met as usual at the community center, both looking slightly tired. "Rough night?" Harold asked, noting the shadows under Margaret's eyes. "Michael called," she said, sitting beside him at the piano. "You?" "Sarah. Apparently Betty's been keeping everyone informed of our friendship." Margaret's fingers found middle C, pressing it softly. "That's what we're calling it, friendship." Harold covered her hand with his, feeling the warmth of her skin. "What would you like to call it?" Before she could answer, they heard voices in the hallway, the morning yoga class arriving. They separated slightly, but something had shifted. Their children's concerns, rather than driving them apart, had forced them to confront their feelings more directly. "Whatever this is," Margaret said softly, her fingers still touching his on the keys, "I'm not ready to let it go, just because our children are uncomfortable." Harold nodded, beginning to play the opening notes of their lesson piece. "Neither am I." The music filled the room, but it was their unspoken words that created the real harmony, a defiant declaration that age didn't diminish the heart's capacity for joy, for connection, for love. The idea for the concert came from Miss June, who remembered the community center's glory days of musical performances. "We could raise money for piano maintenance," she suggested one morning, eyeing the old Steinway's worn finish. And Harold, you could play something special. Harold's immediate instinct was to refuse, but then he caught sight of Margaret's face, glowing with enthusiasm. We could do a duet, she said, her eyes sparkling. Something simple to show what I've learned. And so, against his better judgment, Harold found himself planning a community concert. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire centre was involved. Betty organised ticket sales. Mr. Peterson volunteered to print programs, and the morning yoga group offered to handle refreshments. Their practice sessions took on new intensity. Margaret proved to be a determined student, arriving even earlier to work on their chosen piece, a simple arrangement of heart and soul that Harold had adapted to accommodate her beginner status and his arthritic hands. My father used to play this with me when I was little, Margaret said during one practice, her fingers carefully picking out the melody. He'd let me do the simple part while he added all the flourishes. Harold nodded, watching her hands move across the keys. Claire and I played it at parties. She'd had too much wine once and insisted on adding a jazz improvisation. It was horrible and wonderful at the same time. They shared a laugh, and Harold noticed how Margaret's shoulders relaxed, how her playing improved when she wasn't overthinking it. Music is like life, he found himself saying. Sometimes you have to let go of perfection to find the beauty in it. As the concert date approached, their children's attitudes began to shift. Sarah called one evening after Harold had sent her a video of their practice. "Dad, she makes you smile like Mom used to," she said quietly. "I hadn't realized how much I missed seeing that." Michael flew in from Seattle, ostensibly to check on things, but his skepticism softened when he saw Margaret and Harold working together at the piano. "He's good for you, Mom," he admitted over dinner. "You seem lighter." The evening of the concert arrived with all the excitement of a Broadway opening. The activity room had been transformed, chairs arranged in neat rows, fairy lights strung along the windows. The old Steinway gleamed under a fresh polish, and someone had placed a vase of fresh flowers nearby. Margaret wore a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes, with her husband's wedding ring still on its chain around her neck. Harold chose his best suit, the one he'd worn to Claire's funeral, but tonight it felt different, like a celebration rather than a memorial. They watched from backstage, really just the storage area, as the room filled up. Sarah had come with her family, sitting in the front row next to Michael. Betty was playing usher, showing people to their seats with all the gravity of a Carnegie Hall attendant. "I'm nervous," Margaret whispered, her hand finding Harold's in. "The dimness, me too," he admitted, squeezing her fingers gently, "but we've got each other." The program began with several community performances, the yoga group's teenage daughter playing violin, a local choir singing folk songs, Miss June's art students presenting a multimedia piece. Then it was their turn. As they walked to the piano, together, Harold felt a sudden surge of emotion. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about two people choosing to begin again, choosing to face their fears and embrace possibility. They sat at the piano, adjusting their positions with practiced familiarity. Harold nodded to Margaret, and she began the simple, familiar melody of Heart and Soul. Her part was played slowly, carefully, but with growing confidence. When Harold joined in with the harmony, something magical happened. The piece wasn't perfect. Margaret missed a few notes, and Harold's hands weren't as nimble as they once were, but there was a joy in their playing that filled the room, that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, and made Michael reach for his phone to record it. As they played the final notes, their hands brushed against each other, lingering for just a moment. The applause that followed was thunderous in the small room, but Harold and Margaret barely heard it. They were lost in their own world, where music and memory and new beginnings blended into something beautiful and unexpected. Later, during the reception, Betty would tell anyone who would listen that she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. Miss June would claim credit for the concert idea that brought them closer. Mr. Peterson would grumble about the refreshments while secretly wiping his eyes. But Harold and Margaret, standing close together as they accepted congratulations, knew that the music had simply given voice to what their hearts had already understood, that love, like a well-played melody, could be even sweeter the second time around. The success of the concert changed something in their routine. The community centre had begun leaving the lights on later, tacitly allowing Harold and Margaret to practice into the evening when the building was quieter. On a particularly chilly December evening, they found themselves alone in the activity room, working on a Christmas carol duet as darkness gathered outside the windows. "My fingers aren't cooperating tonight," Margaret sighed, stumbling over a passage they'd been practicing for an hour. The winter weather had made Harold's arthritis worse, and her own hands were stiff with tension. "Perhaps we should call it a night," Harold suggested, though neither made any move to leave the piano bench. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the piano and the coloured lights someone had strung up for the holidays. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. "Do you remember the first snow with Claire?" Margaret asked softly, her fingers idly tracing the piano keys without pressing them. "Robert and I had our first kiss in the snow. He'd taken me ice skating, though he was terrible at it. We both ended up falling." Harold smiled, remembering his own story. "Claire and I were grading papers in my office at the university. She looked out the window, saw the snow, and insisted we go for a walk right then. We left the papers scattered everywhere. I kissed her under a streetlight with snowflakes in her hair." Their hands had stopped moving on the keys, but a different kind of music filled the air between them, the rhythm of shared memories, of understanding, of something new and fragile taking shape. "I still feel guilty sometimes," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, "for being happy, for wanting—" She trailed off, her hand trembling slightly on the keys. Harold turned to face her, seeing in the soft light how her silver hair caught the colours of the Christmas lights, how her eyes held both sadness and hope. "Claire used to say that life was like a symphony," he said quietly, "each movement complete in itself, but part of a larger whole. And what movement are we in now?" Margaret asked, meeting his gaze. The air seemed to crystallize around them. Harold found himself leaning closer, drawn by some force as inevitable as gravity. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parted slightly. Their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling in the quiet room. Then a sharp pain shot through Harold's hand, making him gasp. He'd been gripping the piano's edge too tightly, his arthritic joints protesting the tension. The moment shattered like thin ice. Margaret's eyes flew open, and she pulled back quickly, nearly toppling off the piano bench. "I should go," she said, her voice shaking. "It's getting late, and the snow—" "Margaret, wait," Harold began, but she was already gathering her things, her movements jerky and uncertain. "This was a mistake," she said, not meeting his eyes. We can't—" She pressed her hand to the wedding ring hanging around her neck. "I'm sorry, Harold. I just can't." He watched helplessly as she hurried from the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty building. Through the windows, he could see her pause briefly in the parking lot, her face lifted to the falling snow before getting into her car and driving away. Harold remained at the piano, his hands spread flat on the keys that had brought them together. The pain in his joints was a dull counterpoint to the sharper ache in his chest. On the music stand, Margaret's forgotten scarf lay like an accusation. "What am I doing, Claire?" he whispered to the empty room. For the first time in months, no answer came to him through the music. He played a single note, middle C, where everything had begun. The sound hung in the air, unresolved, like the words they hadn't spoken, like the kiss they hadn't shared. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Cedar Grove in a blank white sheet, as if trying to erase the evening's almost moment. When Betty arrived the next morning, she found Harold's coffee cooling on the piano, untouched, and Margaret's usual chair conspicuously empty. The old Steinway stood silent, its keys holding secrets that neither its player nor his student were ready to face. In their separate homes, both Harold and Margaret lay awake that night, watching the snow pile up outside their windows, each wondering if they'd just ruined the most precious gift life had offered them since losing their spouses. The wedding rings they each kept close seemed heavier somehow, as if the past were reaching out to reclaim its hold on their hearts. The week after the almost kiss, the community center felt like a house in mourning. Harold's absence left a silence that even the morning yoga classes' chimes couldn't fill. His regular chair sat empty, and the old Steinway gathered dust, its keys untouched since that snowy evening. Betty tried calling him the first few days, but her calls went straight to voicemail. Sarah, worried by her father's sudden withdrawal, found him sitting in his darkened living room, Claire's favorite record, playing softly in the background. "You're punishing yourself," she said, taking in the unwashed coffee cups and unopened mail. "And for what? For allowing yourself to feel something?" "You don't understand," Harold replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Every time I close my eyes, I see your mother. When I almost kissed Margaret, I saw Claire's face. How can I betray her like that?" Across town, Margaret wasn't faring much better. She'd taken to walking past the community center on her morning route, slowing her pace as she passed the windows of the activity room. The wedding ring around her neck felt like an anchor, pulling her back from the shores of possibility. Michael called daily now, his voice careful and concerned. "Mom, you're allowed to be happy," he said during one call. "Dad would want that for you." "Would he?" Margaret's voice cracked. "How do you know what he would want? How do I know? 35 years of marriage, and I never thought to ask him, would it be okay if I fell in love again?" The word love hung in the air between them, and Margaret realized it was the first time she'd admitted, even indirectly, what she felt for Harold. The community center regulars watched the situation with increasing concern. Miss June started bringing 2 cups of coffee each morning, leaving one on the piano in case Harold returned. Mr. Peterson grumbled more than usual, his way of showing he missed their morning concerts. Even the young mothers from the reading group asked about the piano man and his friend. One morning, Betty found Margaret standing in the doorway of the activity room, staring at the piano. "He comes at night sometimes," Betty said gently. "The janitor told me he heard music last night around midnight." Margaret touched the piano's smooth surface, finding Harold's coffee cup from the night before, cold and barely touched. Her fingers found middle C, pressing it softly. The note echoed in the empty room, carrying with it all the weight of things unsaid. She thought about their last evening together, about the way Harold's eyes had held both desire and fear, about how her own heart had raced with the same conflicting emotions. They were like 2 people who had learned one language perfectly, only to find themselves suddenly trying to speak another. At home, Harold sat at his own piano, but his fingers refused to play anything but melodies that reminded him of Margaret. Claire's picture watched from the mantel, and for the first time since her death, he turned it face down. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to Claire or Margaret, or perhaps to himself. "I don't know how to do this." The snow that had begun falling on that fateful evening continued throughout the week, blanketing Cedar Grove in white silence. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if 2 hearts could find their way back to the music they'd begun to create together. It was during one of her sleepless nights that Margaret finally sat down at her writing desk, pulled out her best stationery, the cream-colored paper Robert had given her for Christmas years ago, and began to write. "Dear Harold, the irony isn't lost on me that I'm writing this letter on paper Robert gave me, while wearing Claire's favorite perfume. Betty told me which one it was. Perhaps that's exactly right, though, because they're part of this too, aren't they? Part of who we are and who we're becoming." I keep thinking about that evening at the piano, about how right it felt until I let fear take over. You see, I've been having conversations with Robert in my head. Silly, isn't it? But the other day I was looking at our old photos, and I realized something. In every single one, he's smiling. That's who he was. Someone who embraced joy wherever he found it. The guilt we feel, Harold, I wonder if it's less about betraying Them and more about betraying our own grief, as if by being happy again, we're somehow saying those years of loss didn't matter. But you and I both know that's not true. When you play Chopin, I see how your hands move with such tender memory, and I understand. When I wear Robert's ring around my neck, you've never once made me feel like I should take it off. We're not trying to replace what we've lost. We're proving that the heart is capable of writing new music while still remembering the old songs. I miss our mornings together. I miss watching your hands on the keys, strong despite the arthritis. I miss the way you tilt your head when you're concentrating on a difficult passage. Most of all, I miss the way we understand each other's silence. The community center feels empty without your music. Betty tells me you come at night sometimes. I've thought about coming too, about waiting for you there in the darkness. But that would be too easy, wouldn't it? We need to face this in the light. I don't know if I'm ready for grand romance or passionate declarations. But I do know that when I sit at my kitchen table in the morning, I make 2 cups of coffee out of habit now. I know that when I hear Chopin on the radio, my heart beats a little faster. And I know that whatever this is between us, it doesn't diminish what came before. It honors it. Robert once told me that music never really ends. It just waits for someone to pick up the melody again. Maybe that's what we're doing, you and I, creating something new from the echoes of love we've known before. I'll be at the center tomorrow morning at our usual time. If you're ready, I'd like to work on that Christmas carol again. And if you're not ready, I'll understand. But know this, whenever you do come back, I'll be there, ready to find our music again. With hope, Margaret. She sealed the letter in an envelope, her hands trembling slightly. After a moment's hesitation, she wrote, "For Harold," about new songs and old memories on the front. The next morning she arrived at the center early, before even Betty. She placed the letter on the piano, weighting it down with Harold's forgotten coffee cup from his last nighttime visit. Then she sat in her usual spot and waited, her heart keeping time like a metronome, counting the moments until their regular practice hour. The morning light gradually filled the room, catching the dust motes in its beams, making them dance like musical notes come to life. Margaret touched the ring around her neck, and for the first time it didn't feel like an anchor. It felt like a blessing. Sarah found Michael at the Cedar Grove diner, sitting in a booth by the window, watching the snow fall. It felt strange meeting her father's almost girlfriend's son like this. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "You must be Michael," she said, sliding into the booth. "I'm Sarah. Thank you for flying out here." Michael looked up from his coffee, his face carrying the same worried expression she'd seen in her own mirror. "Dad always said Mum could be stubborn, but this is something else," he sighed. "How's your father doing?" "About as well as your mother, I'd guess," Sarah replied, ordering coffee when the waitress came by. "He sits at his piano but doesn't play. Just stares at the keys like they hold some answer he can't quite see." They sat in silence for a moment, these 2 adults trying to parent their parents. Michael pulled out his phone, showing Sarah a photo of Margaret from a few months ago, standing next to Harold at the piano. "I haven't seen her smile like that since Dad died," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, reaching for her own phone. "Look, at this video from their concert, Dad's actually laughing. Do you know how long it's been since I've heard him laugh like that?" The waitress brought Sarah's coffee, and they spent the next hour sharing stories about Robert's jazz performances, about Claire's art shows, about how their parents had been shadows of themselves until they found each other. "We were wrong," Michael admitted, stirring his 3rd cup of coffee, "when we first found out about them. We were so focused on protecting them that we didn't see they were actually healing each other." Sarah watched the snow outside, thinking about the past few months. "They're not trying to replace Mom and Dad," she said slowly. "They're just finding a way to be happy again, and we've been acting like that's something to be ashamed of." "So what do we do?" Michael asked. "Mom's letter has been sitting on that piano for 3 days, and your dad hasn't been back to read it." Sarah straightened in her seat, a plan forming. "First, We go talk to Betty at the community center. Then we're going to need some help from Miss June and Mr. Peterson. And finally, she paused, a small smile playing on her lips. We're going to need to borrow Dad's old record player. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Betty was more than happy to help, producing a key to the center with a conspiratorial wink. Miss June contributed her collection of battery-operated lanterns, while Mr. Peterson surprised everyone by offering his vintage jazz records. As evening fell, Michael drove to his mother's house. "Mum," he said, finding her in her studio, pretending to paint, but really just staring at a blank canvas. "There's something wrong with the piano at the center. Betty's been trying to reach Harold, but he's not answering. They need someone to look at it before tomorrow's children's program." Across town, Sarah was having a similar conversation with Harold. "Dad, the community center called. There's something wrong with the Steinway. They're worried it might be serious." Both Harold and Margaret fell for it completely, their concern for the piano overriding their reluctance to return to the scene of their almost kiss. When Margaret arrived at the center that evening, she found the activity room transformed, battery-operated. Lanterns cast a warm glow, and soft jazz played from Harold's record player in the corner, one of Robert's favorite pieces. Harold arrived moments later, stopping short in the doorway when he saw Margaret standing by the piano. The letter he hadn't yet read still sat where she'd left it, illuminated by the gentle light. Before either of them could retreat, Sarah and Michael slipped out, closing the door behind them. Through the window, their children watched as Harold and Margaret stood frozen, the music washing over them, the lantern light softening their uncertain expressions. Then, slowly, Harold moved toward the piano and picked up the letter. Harold's hands trembled as he held Margaret's letter, the cream-colored paper catching the warm glow of the lanterns. He looked up to find her watching him, her face soft in the gentle light, Robert's jazz playing softly in the background. "Our children are not very subtle," Margaret said, breaking the tension with a small smile. "No," Harold agreed, his voice rough with emotion, "but they mean well." He gestured to the letter. "May I?" Margaret nodded, sinking onto their familiar piano bench as Harold began to read. She watched his face as his eyes moved across the pages, noting how he touched the paper gently, as if it were something precious. When he reached the end, he looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're right," he said quietly, "about all of it, about the grief, about the guilt." He moved to sit beside her on the bench, their shoulders not quite touching. "I've been having conversations with Claire, too." The jazz record ended, leaving them in silence. Harold's fingers found their way to the piano keys, playing a soft, hesitant melody, the beginning of Claire's favorite nocturne that gradually transformed into the jazz piece Robert had loved. "I think," he said, still playing, "they would understand, more than we've been giving them credit for." Margaret's hand moved to the ring around her neck. "Robert always said that love was like his jazz. You never play a piece the same way twice. Each performance is its own unique thing, beautiful in its own right." Harold's playing slowed, then stopped. He turned to face her fully. "I'm sorry I ran away," he said. "That night when we almost—" He paused, gathering his courage. "I wasn't afraid of betraying Claire. I was afraid of how right it felt." Margaret's breath caught. "I know," she whispered. "I felt it too." "The thing is," Harold continued, his hand finding hers on the piano keys, "Claire would have loved you. She would have appreciated your art, your kindness, the way you understand the language of music. And Robert would have loved your stories," Margaret replied, her fingers intertwining with his. "He would have made you play jazz, probably terribly, and laughed with you, not at you." They sat in comfortable silence, their joined hands resting on the keys. Outside, the snow had started again, soft flakes drifting past the windows. The lantern light created shifting shadows that made the room feel like it existed somewhere outside of normal time. "What happens now?" Margaret asked softly. Harold turned to her, his free hand reaching up to gently touch her cheek. "Now," he said, "I'm going to kiss you, if that's all right." Margaret's answer was to lean forward, meeting him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, full of the wisdom of age and the sweetness of new beginnings. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. "I think," Harold said, touching his forehead to hers, "that we just started playing a new piece of music." Margaret laughed softly. "One that honors the old songs while creating something new?" "Exactly." Harold straightened up, his hands finding their place on the piano keys. "Shall we practice that Christmas carol? I believe we were interrupted last time." As they began to play, their children peeked through the window, sharing satisfied smiles before quietly leaving them to their music. Inside, Harold and Margaret played together, their hands moving across the keys in perfect harmony, creating a melody that spoke of love lost and found, of endings and beginnings, of the courage it takes to open your heart again. The old Steinway rang out with joy, its music floating through the empty community center, a song of second chances and the endless possibility of love. Spring came early to Cedar Grove that year, as if nature itself was celebrating Harold and Margaret's newfound happiness. Their first official date wasn't to the movies as originally planned, but rather a quiet dinner at Harold's house where he attempted to recreate Claire's famous lasagna recipe with Margaret's help. "You're putting in too much garlic," she laughed, watching him in the kitchen. She stood behind him, reaching around to guide his hand with the spices, neither of them pretending the closeness was just about cooking. "Claire always said there was no such thing as too much garlic," Harold defended, but he let Margaret adjust the seasoning. The simple domesticity of the moment struck them both. How natural it felt to be together in this way. The community center became their shared space, but now their music took on a different tone. Harold's playing grew more experimental as Margaret introduced him to some of Robert's favorite jazz pieces. In return, he taught her more complex classical pieces, their morning practice sessions filled with laughter and gentle touches. Sarah was the first to notice the changes in her father's house. Small things appeared, a colorful throw pillow. Here, a watercolor painting there. Margaret's artistic touch softened the academic severity of Harold's decorating style. Meanwhile, Michael noticed his mother wearing Claire's perfume more often, and that she'd started keeping classical music playing in her studio while she painted. Their first family dinner together was a masterpiece of awkward moments and tentative connections. Emma, Sarah's teenage daughter, broke the ice by asking Margaret to teach her to paint. Tommy, her younger brother, was more interested in Harold's stories about being a professor. By dessert, the uncomfortable pauses had given way to genuine laughter. "You know what's weird?" Emma said to Michael's daughter Lucy as they cleared the dishes together. "I thought it would feel strange, like they were trying to replace our grandparents. But it doesn't. It's just nice seeing them happy." The wedding rings remained. Margaret's on its chain, Harold's in its special box on his dresser, but they were no longer barriers. They had become testimonies to loves that had shaped them, parts of their history that made their present joy possible. One evening, as they sat at Harold's piano playing a simple duet, Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. "Robert would have loved this," she said softly. "He always said music was meant to be shared." Harold turned to press a kiss to her silver hair. "Claire would have insisted on painting us right now. The light is perfect," she would have said. They continued playing, their fingers dancing across the keys in perfect harmony, creating a new melody while honoring the beloved songs of their past. Summer arrived with the announcement of another community center concert, this time to celebrate the complete restoration of the old Steinway. Harold and Margaret had jointly contributed to its repair, a gesture that Betty declared, "just about the most romantic thing I've ever seen." The piano gleamed under the stage lights, its rich mahogany finish restored to its former glory. The stuck keys had been repaired, the action regulated, and the tone adjusted to perfection. It stood ready for its debut performance, looking almost as nervous and excited as its players. "We should play something that represents both of us," Margaret had suggested during their practice sessions. After much discussion and experimentation, they had arranged a unique medley, a blend of classical and jazz, weaving together Claire's favorite Chopin nocturne with one of Robert's beloved jazz standards. The activity room was packed beyond capacity. Sarah and Michael sat in the front row with their families, sharing proud smiles. Betty had outdone herself with the decorations, transforming the space with flowers and soft lighting. Miss June's art students had created a backdrop of painted musical notes and abstract instruments. As Harold and Margaret took their places at the piano, the audience fell silent. They looked at each other, exchanging a gentle smile, before Harold began the familiar opening notes of the nocturne. Margaret watched his hands move across the keys, remembering how those same hands had first taught her to play, had held hers through their early tentative steps toward love. When the melody shifted into the jazz piece, Margaret joined in, her simpler accompaniment complementing Harold's more complex playing. The transition between styles was smooth, natural, like the way they had blended their lives together. The music spoke of experience and joy, of loss and recovery, of the courage to begin again. Their families watched with tears in their eyes, understanding that this performance was more than just music. It was a testament to love's ability to surprise and renew, even in life's later chapters. The grandchildren beamed with pride, any earlier discomfort long forgotten in the face of their grandparents' evident happiness. As the final notes faded away, the room erupted in applause. Harold and Margaret stood, accepting the ovation with clasped hands and bright eyes. In that moment, surrounded by their families and community, they were no longer just the widow and widower who had found each other at a piano. They were simply and completely themselves, together. 6 months later, Sunday dinners at Harold and Margaret's became a cherished tradition. They had decided to share Harold's house. Its larger space is better suited for family gatherings, while keeping Margaret's home as her art studio. The walls now held a harmonious blend of Claire's paintings and Margaret's watercolors, while Harold's beloved books shared space with Robert's old jazz records. Emma had become a regular fixture in Margaret's studio, her natural talent blooming under her step-grandmother's guidance. Together, they painted scenes of the community center, capturing Harold at the piano in soft watercolors. Tommy, meanwhile, had discovered Harold's collection of classic detective novels, spending hours discussing plot twists and character motivations. With his grandfather, the piano remained their heart center. Every evening, they would play together, their musical repertoire expanding to include everything from Bach to Beatles arrangements. Michael and Sarah often found themselves sharing knowing looks during these performances, remembering their initial resistance to this relationship that had brought so much joy to both families. "Do you remember when we thought this was a bad idea?" Sarah asked Michael one Sunday, watching their parents teach Lucy, Michael's youngest, a simple duet. "We were trying so hard to protect their memories that we almost prevented them from making new ones," Michael replied, smiling as his daughter's delighted laugh filled the room. Their extended family had grown too. Betty became a regular dinner guest, while Miss June often joined them for afternoon tea and impromptu art discussions. Even Mr. Peterson would stop by occasionally, pretending to grumble about the noise, but always staying for just one more song. Harold and Margaret's love had grown deeper, more comfortable, like a favorite piece of music that revealed new nuances with each playing. They had learned to navigate their shared life with grace, respecting each other's need for solitude, while delighting in their togetherness. 1 year to the day after their first almost kiss, Harold and Margaret returned to the community center in the evening. The old Steinway waited for them, its keys gleaming in the soft December light. Harold had arranged everything perfectly. The same colored lights, the same lanterns, even the same jazz record playing softly in the background. "You're up to something," Margaret said, noting how Harold's hands trembled slightly as he helped her with her coat. "You've been acting mysterious all day. Can't an old professor arrange a special evening of music?" Harold asked, trying to sound innocent but unable to hide his smile. They sat at their familiar piano bench, and Harold began to play. Not Chopin or jazz, but Heart and Soul, the simple duet they'd performed at their first concert together. Margaret joined in, their hands moving in perfect synchronization across the keys. As the final notes faded, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside wasn't a traditional ring. Instead, it held a delicate golden treble clef pendant. "Margaret," he said softly, "I'm not trying to replace Robert's ring, just as you've never tried to replace Claire's memory. But I'd like to add a new note to our song." He took a deep breath. "Would you marry me, not to rewrite our past loves, but to compose a new chapter together?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she touched the pendant, then reached for the ring around her neck. "Our first loves taught us how to cherish each other," she said. "I think they'd be happy to know we're still learning new songs." She leaned forward and kissed him, a gesture that held all the warmth of their year together and all the promise of years to come. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." From the hallway came the sound of muffled cheers and applause. They turned to find their entire extended family, children, grandchildren, and their community center family, crowded around the door, Betty at the front wiping away tears. "You all knew?" Margaret asked, laughing through her own tears. "Of course we knew," Sarah said, coming forward to hug them both. "Dad's been planning this for months." "The whole town knows," Michael added with a grin. "Even Mr. Peterson's been keeping the secret." As their families surrounded them with congratulations and joy, Harold and Margaret remained seated at the piano where their story had begun. Their hands found the keys again, and together they played a new melody, one that spoke of love's endless capacity to grow, change, and begin again. The music floated out into the winter evening, a promise of more songs to come, more stories to tell, more love to share. For in the end, their hearts had learned what their music had always known, that the most beautiful symphonies are those that blend the cherished themes of the past with the fresh, surprising melodies of the present, creating a harmony that enriches all who hear it.